probably the first bill that will be introduced in January of 2027 will be the impeachment again of Donald Trump for the third time.
How far do you believe the current US administration's trade and tariff agenda represents a permanent shift away from globalization?
But if it's only profits that a corporation is pursuing, then I think we're going to have a very bleak future in many parts of the world.
Do you think that prolonged sanctions and the use of financial exclusion would accelerate parallel settlement systems, which could reduce the dominance of the US dollar? And what would that mean for global liquidity risk?
Today's episode cuts straight to one of the most consequential questions facing boardrooms, facing investors and governments. Are we watching the collapse of the existing economic and geopolitical order, or simply the rebirth of something that's much more competitive, more volatile, and much more strategic? I'm Dominic Bowen, host of the International Risk Podcast, and we speak with the leaders who aren't just commenting on global risk, but actually shaping how leaders respond to it. Today, you'll hear Alyssa Garbell, our production and investigative lead at the International Risk Podcast, in a conversation with John Sitilides. He's a geopolitical strategist whose briefings include senior policymakers in Washington and executives from all over the world. Now, John's going to offer a rare, unfiltered assessment of the new era of tariffs, of de-risking, and the escalated split between the US and China.
How far do you believe the current US administration's trade and tariff agenda represents a permanent shift away from globalization rather than a cyclical political deviation?
Well, first off, there's no such thing as a permanent situation here. I mean, this may ebb and flow depending on who is president, but I would say certainly for probably the remainder of the Trump administration, so for the next 3+ years, this will be the situation. I mean, President Trump has been quite open and transparent throughout his adult life as a firm believer in tariffs. Not only to rebalance structural and growing trade deficits that the U.S. suffers with the People's Republic of China, with the European Union, with a number of Asian countries, with Mexico, but also because he believes that the U.S. government can generate significant revenues to offset a growing trade deficit, now anywhere between $1.2 to $1.8 trillion a year, which is resulting in a $38 trillion federal debt, which has resulted in federal debt service of over $1 trillion a year, which now exceeds the annual American military budget. So I think he's looking for a number of ways to use tariffs to recalibrate and rebalance our trade relations with countries around the world, to improve America's fiscal balance and order here in Washington. And then we'll see to what extent a Republican who might succeed him would continue with these tariff policies, whether a Democrat might, or whether there'll be a reversal. And then, of course, we'll have to see how the Supreme Court rules. They may decide that much of the tariff agenda under President Trump is unconstitutional. But both President Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have made very clear there are other tariff instruments that they will make available to the administration, even if they don't have the kind of scope and breadth and scale of the current tariff policies.
Given the transactional and rapidly shifting nature of US trade policy, how would multinational firms effectively price and hedge against tariff unpredictability in their long-term contracts? You said that hopefully the Republicans or whomever follows up would follow on the current route. What would be the best way for companies to deal with it?
I think President Trump has been very direct and very transparent on this. What he's also looking to accomplish is to persuade as many companies as possible that want to access the vast and affluent American consumer market, the richest market in the world, by building factories and facilities here in the United States. He's very direct about this. If you build in the U.S., you don't have any tariffs to deal with. If you build outside the U.S. and seek to export into the vast, affluent U.S. consumer market, you will be dealing with some type of baseline tariff. Right now, it looks like it'll be about 10% for the foreseeable future. And then ideally, if you are existing or operating out of a country that has higher than baseline tariffs, you might want to seek to build facilities in a neighboring country, a nearby country, or an allied partner country that is enjoying these baseline tariffs. But that's really for corporate executives to decide. President Trump, very bluntly, very starkly, is not seeking to do any favors for any corporate executives in countries outside the United States. If they want the best partnership, the best access into the U.S. market, the best way to do so, according to President Trump, is to operate from within the United States. So that's really a corporate decision and long-term investment decision by corporate executives. It may not make sense for those companies, and then they'll simply have to bake in the tariffs into into their pricing policies and other expenses. But it's pretty straightforward by the president, and I believe he means it when he says America first. If these are activities and operations that will benefit the American consumer and the American citizenry, then that's what he hopes to encourage corporate executives to undertake going forward.
There's been quite a bit of backlash from other countries and other companies, obviously because of the tariffs. Do you think that trade could reinforce between other countries and therefore they might not be interested in trading with the US because of these tariffs?
That could very well be an offshoot of this policy, an unintended consequence. And we see this in many ways already taking place with the informal network of countries that are members of BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa launched the BRICS network back in 2008 or so. About 2 years ago, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates formally joined BRICS. And I believe it was in January of 2025 that Indonesia formally joined as a member. And now there are probably at least a half a dozen, maybe as many as a dozen countries that are waiting in the wings, hoping to become formal members. And what I think you have here is not so much any direct competition against the G7 or the G20. Many of these countries are enemies or rivals in their own right. So it's not as if they're going to be as cohesive as are, say, the G7 members. But what they are looking to do is to inoculate their own economies from the kind of weaponization of dollar dominance or the American dominance of the international financial systems, as in the SWIFT system for financial payments communications, and look to see to what extent they might be able to trade bilaterally or in minilaterals, three-way, four-way trade using local currencies and not having to purchase dollars in order to engage in trade. So you may have something along those lines taking place, but I think President Trump feels ultimately that it would be self-punishing for any company, and for that matter, any country, to set up a regulatory regime that denies those countries' companies or any particular company access into the US market. There really is nothing that compares for the foreseeable future to the US market. And even if there is, say, by size, right, where there were several hundred so-called middle income Chinese in the People's Republic of China, the per capita GDP in China is far lower than that of the United States. So if you take just the sheer size of America's 335, 340 million population and the per capita GDP, there simply is no comparison. So if companies decide to punish their shareholders and their executives and their own stakeholders by denying themselves access into the US market, my sense is that President Trump will say, go have at it.
To what extent do you think that businesses can generally de-risk for their supply chains without suffering prohibitive cost increases or efficiency losses? Because that's essentially what you've been saying so far.
They may not be able to as successfully as they had during the so-called era of globalization, right? When we had from the early 1990s until maybe about 10, 15 years ago, the era of seamless, just-in-time inventory globalization, where there was this, in retrospect, naive sense that all countries were operating by the same free and open trading rules. And I think what we've had, especially with the rise to General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping, is a very belligerent foreign policy and trading policy where prior to Xi Jinping, Chinese general secretaries would abide by a policy of bide your time, hide your strength, and not unnecessarily alarm your neighbors, your trading partners, and keep growing the Chinese economy. And under Xi Jinping, we've seen a far more aggressive trading policy. We've seen the weaponization of China's dominance, especially, say, for instance, in the rare earth elements that was just unveiled several weeks ago, which in the short term will likely be of great benefit to China because the US and so many advanced industrial economies are dependent on those rare earth elements for their own economies and their own technological development. But you see already that President Trump is traveling around the world, entering into agreements with countries to be able to secure access to very valuable rare earth element, critical metals and critical minerals mining access. Of course, China will continue to dominate the refinement and processing of rare earth elements for at least the next half decade to decade, but the beginning of that de-risking has already begun. And when we had the COVID pandemic lockdowns, we recognized to what extent, I'll just speak from an American perspective here, the US economy was utterly dependent on China for essential pharmaceuticals and for personal protective medical and equipment and the like. And we also have come to realize that this kind of dependency is not in the interest of the United States from a national defense perspective. Much of our American defense industrial base is dependent on sub-suppliers inside of China for the ball bearings and magnets and semiconductors and components and materials for partial assembly before you get to the full assembly inside the United States of, for instance, the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile, the F-35 fighter jet, Tomahawk cruise missiles, Ohio-class nuclear submarines, the Patriot anti-missile system. These are America's most important and mighty weapon systems, and they're dependent on the goodwill of the Chinese Communist Party to build in the years ahead. And I think also the extent to which we'll be looking to protect not only our semiconductor lead, and to date at least, the lead in artificial intelligence training, especially with the most advanced chips, a la those that are designed by NVIDIA, but also to protect our own telecommunications infrastructure and energy systems from cyber attacks from China. These are all the ways in which we are already beginning to de-risk the American economy and American society from China. But keep in mind, China has begun this process already. While we're debating whether or not this is the way to proceed, I believe it was in 2023, the Wall Street Journal had a very important expose on a program called Document 79. And this is where Xi Jinping has ordered all Chinese state-owned enterprises to begin to become independent of American hardware and software systems by 2027.
So, do you think that full digital and technological purification between the US and China is inevitable? Or are we seeing a form of hybrid standards emerging?
Well, again, keep in mind that it was China that had firewalled its own country against American and Western technology and social media companies. So Google is banned in China, Facebook is banned, X is banned, YouTube is banned. So many of our media are banned in China. They've already banned so much of American and Western technology companies and social media companies from operating in China, whereas they very fully, and I don't blame them one bit, very readily exploit the openness of American, European, and democratic East Asian societies. In the US, we're having an argument as to whether or not TikTok, whose data is ultimately controlled by the Chinese company ByteDance, which is accountable to the Chinese Communist Party, should operate freely in the United States. And we have Temu and Shine and WeChat and all of these companies and DeepSync, and all of these are able to operate in the United States and in, again, the global West, so to speak, Europe and East Asia, while they have completely walled off their society from Western technology. So this really is a very one-sided campaign. And the idea that somehow we need to go through some hand-wringing in the West and absolve China of any responsibility to participate as a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder in the international trading system, I think really exposes how weak the West has been in dealing with the Chinese threat for the last quarter century.
So, what secondary consequences should markets prepare for if sanctions continue to target Russian energy and possibly extend to other major suppliers, such as Iran or Venezuela, as we've seen?
Very interesting question. Let me sort of break this down by the countries in the question. Keep in mind, first of all, that President Trump is a very strong believer in low energy prices. For him, if you don't have a functional energy market in your country, everything else will suffer as a result. It's also one of the reasons why he's been so critical, for instance, of the policies of certain European Union countries to allow themselves to become dependent on Russia, never fearing that Russia would eventually weaponize its energy dominance over, say, countries like Germany and other countries in Europe that are now suffering, and the United Kingdom, with extraordinarily expensive energy prices, effectively impoverishing the middle class in so many European countries because of these reckless energy policies. So here at home, President Trump, I think, is doing his very best to ensure that the price of oil and energy remains as low as possible, not so low that it bankrupts oil and gas companies and coal companies and the like, but to strike the lowest balance possible between earning a healthy profit for the companies and ensuring that Americans enjoy the least expensive energy possible, and that American companies also enjoy the least expensive energy prices possible, especially in the context now of the insatiable demand for electricity to build out AI training and data centers and the overall electrification of the American economy and those, frankly, of our allies in Europe and in East Asia. So I think as it pertains to Russia, I think there's a sense that even with the new sanctions that have been imposed on Rosneft and on Lukoil, that overall there won't be any significant rise in the price of oil, anything that would endanger, again, the president's policies domestically here in the United States, and very importantly, to ensure that the president's Republican Party allies in the Senate and the House of Representatives don't lose control of those bodies in the off-year elections that we have in November of 2026, because if the Democratic Party wins the Senate or the House, it's the end of any legislative achievements for President Trump in the remaining 2 years of his presidency. And also, if especially in the House of Representatives, that goes into Democratic control, probably the first bill that will be introduced in January of 2027 will be the impeachment again of Donald Trump for the third time. So I think that's really what's the domestic focus of many of the policies that are inherent in the question that you ask. So I think the sense is that there's not going to be any significant impact on oil prices domestically or globally. And oil prices are set on global markets, unlike natural gas, which is really set on spot markets. And as it pertains to Iran and to Venezuela, I think the president intends to be very careful. When President Trump ordered the destruction of Iran's nuclear weapons facilities in June of this year, the strikes were limited to just those facilities. There was no attack on the government, on military facilities, anything that would lead to a possible collapse of the regime, however noxious, however odious, and however destabilizing it is in the Middle East and beyond, because we don't want to see the kind of chaotic flow of millions of refugees from Iran into Saudi Arabia, into Iraq, into Kuwait, or into Europe for that matter, as happened with Syria and Afghanistan during previous wars. So I think the idea is to encourage a change in behavior by the regime in Iran so that it becomes a normal country, a normal neighbor that isn't financing terrorism and destabilization against Saudi Arabia, against Israel, and for that matter, is no longer sponsoring terrorism in European and American cities as it has for the last 35 years. And similarly, I think there's not really an intention to depose the regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, because if you have sort of regime change there, you probably would have chaos throughout South and Central America. Millions of Venezuelan refugees, far more than has already been the case over the last 10, 15 years, spilling over into Colombia, into Peru, into Chile, into Brazil, and up into the Panama and Central American countries towards the United States in numbers that we've been so far under the Trump presidency been able to control with the nearly completely shut down border between Texas and Mexico. So I don't know to what extent the secondary and tertiary order consequences would go beyond anything along those lines. I think President Trump's aim is to achieve diplomatic goals while causing as little regional chaos, disruption and upending of global energy markets, given the importance of all three of those countries, right? Venezuela is the country with the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Iran may have the largest natural gas or is among the top natural gas exporters in the world. And Russia, both oil and gas and coal, but also natural resources like timber and diamonds and critical metals and minerals and rare earth elements, fertilizers to help feed billions of people around the world, all coming from the Russian economy. So I think there's a balance in terms of how effectively and how rapidly we can achieve our diplomatic objectives without destabilizing those capitals and the countries around them.
Do you think that prolonged sanctions and the use of financial exclusion would accelerate parallel settlement systems, which could reduce the dominance of the US dollar? And what would that mean for global liquidity risk?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, you already have the formation of this informal network of countries within BRICS, and you may have other minilaterals formed, again, to protect these countries and provide them a measure of strategic depth and protection against US dollar dominance as the global reserve currency and its dominance over the international financial system. But there's really no viable alternative, at least for the foreseeable future, to the dollar. So however much angst you see in many capitals, financial capitals around the country over this American dollar dominance, the euro is really in no place to replace the dollar. The renminbi certainly is not. The yen is not. The pound is not. And if there were to be a quote unquote BRICS currency, President Trump, I think, declared several months ago that any attempt to form a BRICS currency would immediately bring, I believe it's a 100% tariff on every country that participates in this BRICS currency. So there might be a very long-term, slow, gradual chipping away. Right now, I think the dollar is used for about 70% of global commercial transactions. Maybe it goes down to the mid-60s in a decade or 2 decades, but very slow, very gradual, and again, with no viable alternate in sight. However, I think there already has been a significant move to potentially replace the US dollar as the global reserve asset. And you see this because of inflation in the United States, a federal debt that seems to be growing without any limits, without any controls, without any serious effort by Republicans and Democrats together to get our annual deficits and our overall federal debt under control. And so you see that recently gold and silver as commodities hit their highest prices, record prices. That may be cyclical, but right now you see that gold and silver are being utilized as reserve assets. Also, commodities such as oil, which is highly cyclical. But in the long run, the International Energy Agency of the United Nations, I think, reported several weeks ago, there won't be peak oil in terms of global demand for at least 25 years until beyond 2050. So oil in the long term is a superb reserve asset. And then you also have other options such as the IMF special drawing rights and even Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So I think you're already starting to see a much more substantive chipping away of the US dollar as the global reserve asset.
How should multinational boards decide which geopolitical blocks to prioritize? So I'm thinking about the US, EU, and China. You already said that the euro isn't strong enough, the pound isn't strong enough, but each of them have now different regulations and different laws. For example, the EU is strongly regulated and they tend to be very big on laws. How should a company decide where to stay at and how to make sure which side to prioritize?
Well, that will certainly depend, first of all, on each individual company's objectives, operations, corporate culture, sectors. I mean, there's really no blanket approach, I think, to something along these lines. But I would put a blanket approach to the other side, not so much the corporate decision making, but the markets in which they would choose to operate. And in many ways, the system that we enjoy today of relative unprecedented prosperity and relative peace, at least within the global West, is predicated on a free market system that is open and dynamic and innovative and based on the free choices and the free movement of individuals, of entrepreneurs, of capital, of goods and services. And that is probably the ideal environment for most companies in which to operate. Also, they abide by the rule of law. You know that you're able to enter into an agreement and have the courts protect your rights. You also have labor standards and environmental standards and human rights standards that bring a very important ethical perspective into how a corporation operates. And then you have the alternative. If we have a parallel system that Beijing is looking to create within China, of course, but then to export it to other countries, either through the Belt Road Initiative, through the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and other state enterprises that are lending or making credit available to countries and to companies in other parts of the world. And then you also have the notorious China Standards 2035 initiative that was unveiled by Xi Jinping in 2019, I believe it was, where China would look to establish the norms and values and standards and platforms for the global interoperability of the technologies in which it dominates. Right now, that's solar panels and wind turbines, right? Weather dependent, intermittent energy, electric vehicles, lithium ion storage batteries. Even beyond those new technologies, steel, for instance, the production of which China absolutely dominates on a global scale, shipbuilding, where it's competing with Japan and South Korea. But the US now it has a shipbuilding capacity that is 1/230th that of the global shipping sector. So we look to see to what extent China is able to take this global interoperability and apply Leninist one party absolute rule standards to possibly create a techno authoritarian state command surveillance system that largely strips its citizens, whether in China today or in countries that would import that model, that strips its citizens of data privacy, of human rights, of individual liberties, and of political freedom. And I think corporate executives need to think hard about what kind of a system they would like to pass on to their fellow countrymen, to their children and grandchildren, to the generations to follow, and whether it's one that should adopt and adhere to Western standards that has given us this tremendous convenience and quality of life that we enjoy in the West, or whether we want to move in a very dark direction, a la the whims and the wishes of the Chinese Communist Party.
What skills or governance changes are most urgent for boards and executives to ensure agility and ethical coherence?
Yeah, I think that's an issue that many corporate executives and investment portfolio managers are still grappling with. I think the stark contrast that I just laid out is a difficult one for many corporate executives who tend to take a bottom line approach. What is most profitable for the company? And I understand that to a large degree. But if it's only profits that a corporation is pursuing, then I think we're going to have a very bleak future in many parts of the world. The extent to which we're able to align corporate objectives and business policy aims with a system of ethics and of principles based on trust, based on reliability, based on openness, based on clean systems. Right? There's a great fear right now, especially in Europe and increasingly here in the United States, that many of the Chinese systems that are being exported around the world, not only produce a very dangerous dependency on a country that is looking to upend the global order by 2049. That would be the centennial of the Communist Party's takeover of Beijing. And they've been very open about this. This is open source intelligence. But I think also the fact that they have deliberately contaminated, and there's really no other verb for it, the technology systems that they sell to Western companies, whether it's cranes at ports, whether it's telecommunication systems, whether it's electric buses and other vehicles. These are all have bugs that can be controlled by companies that are accountable to the Chinese Communist Party. So, in the event of a crisis between, say, Beijing and Taipei over the ability of Taiwan to remain a free market democratic entity, or China's increasing belligerence against the Philippines, or China's dispute over the sovereignty by Tokyo over a number of Japanese islands in the East China Sea. And if you have European governments that take a diplomatic stance that Beijing finds distasteful, do you start to see more cyber attacks against Europe's infrastructure, against European ports, against European water grids and utilities and transportation grids and telecommunications networks? Hopefully, this never quite materializes, but this is the danger that we're dealing with right now. So, if the primary goal of a corporate executive is to, again, revert to a seamless just in time inventory trade relationship with a China or a similar country, it could bring about great harm to those corporate executives' fellow countrymen. And I think that's where you're starting to see also a reversion to not necessarily nationalism with a sort of negative or derogatory definition to it, but a sense that there is an obligation to one's country that provides you the corporate environment, the regulatory environment, the legal framework, the financial and economic freedom, the labor force to be able to generate significant profits. And companies really are not global entities. They're national entities with a global presence. So I think this is going to be an important place for corporate executives to consider approaching. And I would also add that there really needs to be far deeper consideration of not forecasting, but very agile scenario planning, incorporating geopolitical, geoeconomic, and for that matter, geotechnological risk in assessments for corporate planning purposes, for investment planning purposes, considering, as we talked about before during the course of this interview, secondary and tertiary consequences, right? Second and third order ramifications of various decisions, and to go beyond linear thinking and to engage in lateral thinking and create new mental models for how to grapple with a very, very difficult global economic environment. The relatively peaceful interregnum of 25 years between the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s and again the end of globalization, of peak globalization between 2010 and 2015 with the rise of Xi Jinping and Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which went largely unchallenged by the West, by the US and by Europe, means that we're dealing with the reality and the brutality of a very different global environment that corporate executives will have no choice but to grapple with and to prioritize technological resilience, to build a strong protective shield around data, around the privacy of their personnel, to deal with cyber attacks and now even AI attacks. Anthropic announced just several days ago that there were actors inside of China that were manipulating AI to be able to engage in attacks against Anthropic, one of the leading new AI companies. And then ultimately, I would say it's important for our business schools to emphasize values integration and to build a foundation for ethical principles so that we take considerations beyond pure profit bottom lines into consideration when we're making decisions to uphold what is finest and most bountiful from a Western perspective, and to be honest about, again, the kind of future that we may bequeath to our children and grandchildren if we simply cave in to achieve profitable bottom lines by engaging in the kind of business that has been very, very dangerous to date with the People's Republic of China and will become increasingly so as China becomes even more advanced and more effective in weaponizing its leading technologies against adversaries and against the global West.
In that vein, when you look around the world, what are the risks that concern you the most?
From a purely geopolitical perspective, the potential for a major crisis between China and the United States over Taiwan, over the Philippines, Japan, or the South China Sea, which is the world's maybe most important waterway. 1/3 of all commerce annually traverses the South China Sea, which China has declared to be effectively a Chinese lake, a sovereign Chinese lake 1,000 miles from its southern coast off the island of Hainan. And this is at the usurpation of the exclusive economic zones of Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and Indonesia, Southeast Asian tiger countries and ASEAN. And the US has a legal obligation to come to the defense of Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Japan, South Korea. So any type of a conflict between China and its East Asian neighbors major in the United States. So I think every day, American policy planners in this administration and in succeeding administrations, their number one foreign policy and national defense objective will be to persuade Xi Jinping now and whoever his successor might be that every day is the worst day to even think about greenlighting an amphibious invasion or even a blockade or a quarantine of Taiwan that could lead to catastrophic global economic consequences that would exceed the magnitude of what the COVID pandemic lockdowns did 3 and 4 and 5 years ago. So that's my number one concern there in terms of what hopefully we can avoid. And I would say for especially a global audience, watch for the imminent release of the U.S. new national defense strategy under the recently renamed Department of War, no longer the Department of Defense under President Trump, where we have not only the prioritization of the Indo-Pacific region and the hopeful, successful deterrence of China from, again, any invasion or any reckless hostile act against Taiwan, but also to prioritize the American defense of the Western Hemisphere, and ultimately with the goal of expelling China, Russia, and Iran from Venezuela and from the presence they have in many Latin American and South American countries and in the Caribbean.
Well, that was a really interesting conversation with John and Elisa, and exactly the kind of in depth conversations we aim to bring you on the International Risk podcast every single week. So if you like today's episode, please share it with a friend or colleague. Now, John's analysis today really reinforced something that I'm seeing every week when I advise senior business leaders. And that's that geopolitical risk is no longer just a backdrop. It's something that directly impacts our balance sheets, creates supply chain issues, and it's something that boardrooms and executive teams need to be considering every single day. And the companies that thrive and that will thrive over the next decade are the ones that are building clarity now. They've got this ethical coherence, they've got this strategic adaptability, and it's built into their operating environment. So, if today's conversation challenged some of your assumptions or perhaps sharpened your view of US China relations, well, please remember to subscribe to our content on YouTube and wherever you watch or listen to your podcasts. I'm Dominic Bowen, host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again next week.